Hello and welcome. We're thrilled to have everybody tuning in today to learn a little bit more about the topics that really influence our young entrepreneurs. The Cleantech Challenge is a part of the ecoculture here at Portland State. We choose these topics in order to try to inspire people to explore different avenues within entrepreneurship. Today we're going to be talking about engineering for one planet, and specifically designing for the product life cycle. There's such a need for us to consider where things are coming from, where things are going, and how the engineering process itself can have a dramatic impact on our planet. We're thrilled to have panelists today from a variety of backgrounds. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but we're going to be joined today by Hadram Mumperdun, by Raja Schaefer, and by Sean Hunter. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves. First off, we're going to start with Hadram. Welcome.
Hello. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Hadram Mumperdun. And when I first heard the word sustainability and learned what it meant, what it proposed, it put everything that I'd been thinking about and doing together. It put the natural world and the human world together. All of my thoughts about change, ongoingness, resilience, and systems thinking, what I'd been doing as an engineer, as a graphic designer, an artist, typographer, and now a professor of design at Art Center College of Design. It integrated all of my experience and my learning, and it led to a moment in which I realized that everything mattered. Not only did it matter to me, but everything mattered to how I did my work.
Thank you so much for that. And next we'll be joined by Raja.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. So I'm really excited about this panel. I'm always up for talking about ways that we can be better about our practice as designers. And it's exciting to talk about sustainability in context of the material life cycle, as it really does relate far larger than just the cycle itself, and it extends out sort of like a web. So I'm excited to talk about ways that I've been able to connect sustainability and the development of products to everything to do with society, to thinking about sort of like history in the future, but also policy and other integrated systems related to design. And it's one of those areas that I've been very passionate about as an individual since I was a kid, but it's something that I came to in my education in the late 90s. And it really has been something that should be integrated into all ways that we practice innovation, entrepreneurship, design, engineering, and all aspects of our learning. So I'm excited about this.
That's excellent. I'm really looking forward to learning more about some of the ways that you are integrating into the classroom right now. And last of all, I'm very excited to be joined by Sean Hunter. Sean, would you give us a quick introduction?
Thank you, Abigail, and hello, everybody. So I'm Sean Hunter, and sustainability is a huge part of my why. I believe that we are not yet at a sustainable place. We're not yet at a place where every person on the planet is thriving and we're living within the limits of the planet. And I have a lot of work to do there to get to that point. So what I do, I work at DuPont. I am a sustainability leader for one of our business units. And what that means is that I have the honor of leading sustainability strategy for that business unit, and working with my fellow leaders in terms of driving progress against that strategy. Which for us, so I work in the building and construction business unit in DuPont. For us, that means driving the built environment, the buildings, the places where we live, work, and play, to a place of zero total carbon, to a place of complete circularity, and to a place where all materials are made from green chemistry, from things that are safer by design. So have the opportunity to work with many awesome colleagues who aspire to do the same thing. Also do a little bit of adjunct work on sustainability and chemical engineering at the University of Michigan. So really looking forward to today's conversation Part of my background includes life cycle assessment as a subject matter expert, and I just think life cycle design, life cycle thinking is just so critical to solve our sustainability challenges. So looking forward to an engaging session today.
Thank you. Well, this really kind of leads straight into my first question, especially, Raja, your note about how you see this as just incredibly important that we're teaching this to students. What are some of the fresh ways that you guys are approaching teaching young innovators and the next generation about, investing in the longevity of products and the examination of, product eco cycles?
So I'll start maybe. So one of the ways that I try to integrate it in my practice, and I don't know if I actually said this about myself, but I am the program director and assistant professor of product design at Drexel University. And there's kind of like two ways that I've really been approaching it most recently, and they're a little bit expansive, but one is really focused on integrating bio-inspired design or biomimicry as a design practice that is really influential at all aspects of it. And that connects to life cycle thinking, but also connects to issues of circularity. And it also addresses issues related to climate change. And it also talks about materials. I think Sean mentioned green chemistry, but it's kind of understanding ways that we can create less harmful materials based on the ways that the materials are structured in nature is one strategy to look at. And so bio-inspired design can be a systems-based strategy. It can be a material-based strategy. It could be a functional thing. Also looking at different behaviors. And it can integrate across all ways that we design, including physical goods, but also looking at policies and networks and communities. And then another way that I've really been focusing in the last few years is focusing on design futuring. And really thinking about climate futures, design futures, and speculative design, and thinking about how we have gotten to a place where we have a world that we don't necessarily realize, didn't realize at the time that we were creating such harmful conditions, but also how can we use those strategies to figure out ways to solve some of the issues that we've created in our planet.
So at DuPont, some of the ways that we're approaching sustainability education is really just starting with that foundation of, what are the big issues? Why are they important? Why do they matter? Again, if I think about things like climate or circularity or safer by design chemistry, right, from a materials perspective, what does that all mean? What's the timing of what needs to happen by when, right? So something like the urgency of climate and what we need to do over now the next 8 years. The more folks, designers, innovators, engineers, marketers have that perspective, the more they're able to act on it. So we're sort of starting with this base level understanding, and then knowing, I guess, also when to pull in the experts. Part of the theme today is on life cycle thinking, life cycle design. So there's a certain amount of life cycle thinking that I think everybody can do. But at some point, when it's time to crunch the numbers, you need to know when to bring the experts in. So, we're also working with some of our folks who want to really develop that expertise and be able to use LCA to help advise the project development as we go.
I will add to that. And I saw the question more as how can design education incorporate what kinds of methods can we use to inspire students during the ideation process, during the design phase. So what I've been working on is a kind of it's almost like a teeter-totter. The first thing that students get is an entire term on design for sustainability. So why are we even talking about sustainability? What does it mean theoretically? And what are some examples that we can offer the students? In my mind, there's no greater inspiration for design than sustainability because it's so comprehensive, because it does include environmental aspects, social, cultural, and economic. So all of that lays the foundation for design decision making, and again around this big idea of sustainability. And because the idea is so big, we simplify. So once it gets into a design studio, we say, okay, now that you understand what sustainability is, we're going to teach you a method called life cycle assessment, in which you can do research that's appropriate to your product category or system category. We also bring in the sustainable development goals. We align with the goals. That certainly helps us incorporate more of the social and cultural impact aspects of sustainability. And once they have this rich groundwork of information, then it follows the design process. Students sift through that research and allow it to inspire the ideation process and the concept development. So that's kind of how we've structured it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And that leads us to another one of the questions. Like, these methodologies are incredibly important to talk about, not just when it comes to design and engineering and all of that, but with those methodologies, what are some ways that you think that you have been really effective in inspiring students to look deeper? Or do you think that your engineers who are coming out of school, engineers who are currently in school, are already looking for this, that we have created a generation seeking these solutions?
I mean, I think it's a great question, because I feel like that's something that I went to school. I shouldn't say went to school. I was born in the 70s. And so a lot of my early education was in the 80s and the 90s. And there was a big emphasis on personal environmental responsibility at the time. And it was all about what you could do to save the whales, what you could do to save the rainforest. And, don't use hairspray, cut up 6-pack rings, right? There were these recommendations and strategies that were really pushing the responsibility onto the consumer. And at the time I took it to heart, and it was definitely part of our family's culture, in terms of we're a family that recycles. We're a family that, prefers things that are natural. And so there's a mild granola ness where, we didn't have a lot of processed things. And so I feel like I took that sense of personal responsibility with myself to school in the late 90s. And when I was there, I was able to read The Green Imperative by Victor Papanek, and it was part of our materials and manufacturing course. We had 2 at the time. And in that book, it really connected that nothing that I was going to do, myself, was going to have effective change as an individual consumer using products. I could buy all the compostable egg cartons I wanted to. I could cut up all the 6-pack rings. But until things happened at an industry and societal and a government level, the likelihood that the effects of those things were not going to have the same ripple effect at larger scale decisions. And so I do feel like there was this sense of I was sort of duped into thinking that I on myself could change it. But knowing that it needed to be a societal change to have real impact meant that while I was cutting up rings, the government industry was doing whatever they wanted to, right? Continuing to pollute, continuing to produce products that were poorly designed in the context of recyclability or repairability or reusability. And so there's been sort of this legacy of ignored all the ways that we could have had really meaningful strategies of change. And now we've led to this sense of really inevitable destruction and demise of the planet that could have been prevented had the responsibility been pushed onto the people who actually had the power. And so a lot of my work is really thinking about how do we empower and inform everyone, especially those who fall victim to the decisions of others, as it relates to the effects of poor choices. And those are specifically in this context talking about when we are not designing in a sustainable way, who really isn't sustained or who was let down first. And largely we're talking about vulnerable populations in the nature and on the planet, talking about marginalized communities, talking about countries that are poor. And so now that that's reached sort of this tipping point, I feel like students are coming in understanding that it's not their individual responsibility. It is responsibility of the system of education. It's responsibility of industry. It's responsibility of all people in positions of power to make better choices, but also to fund those decisions, and also to be held accountable for them. There's a lack of accountability, I think, that's led to where we are today. And what I've seen from my students is a demand for more accountability. And so when I'm teaching these strategies, it really is thinking about what are very specific ways in which you can approach your design, thinking about at every point of the life cycle, from material extraction to, assembly, use, manufacturing, to the use of the product, but also what happens at the end of use or end of life of the product, right? And how has that been bad, but also thinking about the ethical decisions all along the way too, that have allowed poor decisions to actually come out into the products that we use, or harmful decisions, not just poor, not just like oversight, but things that have really caused real harm for people. And I find that students are happy to discuss those things in real tact. I don't have to make it fun or engaging. They're already outraged. But I do try to make it fun. So I do definitely incorporate a lot of gamification and game-based learning. I have a climate futures world building game that I've incorporated. And we definitely try to also connect it to real world issues in the community, but also allow for students to focus on sort of like these speculative futures-based projects, in which case they can imagine things that are far beyond where we are now in worlds that may be worse off or better off than where we are now.
It sounds like you are looking at lots of different ways to not only really integrate these things into your curriculum through the needs and desires and the feedback from your students, but you're viewing ways of supporting them whenever they're outside the classroom. I'd love to know what everybody is doing to really work with maker students or young makers in their area in order to support their quest for sustainability, for functionality, for low waste designs. What resources have you found exist in your communities, or that you're working to help create and then reinforce in your communities?
Okay, I'll jump in there. As far as supporting makers, I've found that to be very complicated, because makers operate on a short timeline. They're usually they want to be up and running and profitable in a short period of time, and they find it more difficult to incorporate a very kind of deep process of research and evaluation and iteration that is really needed if you're going to develop a concept, a design that operates in a sustainable way. So, but what I have seen taking place recently is that there are new standards for performance around the subject of sustainability. Before, it was sustainability was whatever anyone defined it to be. They could take whichever pillar they wanted to use, or a combination of pillars. Maybe a carbon footprint would be measured. And so it was kind of a little bit of helter-skelter in the maker world. Some were making these claims and others were making no claims. But over the last 5 years, at least for me, I've found that product developers, makers, companies are incorporating a host of new standards for performance. So we see terms like, carbon neutrality. That's driving a lot of the kind of sustainability performance. Not just carbon footprints, but zero plastic. Different the workplace, the company, the people that work in the company, the users, the stakeholders, this whole notion of stakeholder mapping now being also kind of a tool for sustainable design. So I'm changing what I'm teaching in the classroom, and I'm changing how I mentor makers by encouraging them to become very familiar with the basic standards, certainly the Sustainable Development Goals that is fully incorporated now into kind of my teaching, and then the metrics that would allow us to track and verify and compare whether we meet those goals. So that's kind of where I am right now in terms of teaching and advising.
I think those are some really important concepts that I can pick up on. We spent some time thinking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and what does that mean from an innovation perspective? And they're so high level, they get really hard to apply at an individual project level, but you can use them as inspiration for the problems that you want to solve. And so it's almost like starting with those high level mega trends, and how does that inform the strategy that you, as a speaking from the business perspective, the strategy you're going to put in place to address certain problems. And then once you've got that, you sort of have your swim lanes for the types of projects that you're going to take on, or the problems you're going to solve. Once you get into an individual project where maybe it is a new product design, renew product design, a new process, whatever it is, then I think you can get into some of those metrics that Hadrian was talking about, right? And a lot of those common metrics certainly these days have to do with climate and embodied carbon, or that product carbon footprint. The circularity space is another interesting evolving one. There's no perfect way to measure circularity, but there are a lot of different metrics that you can apply on kind of the front end and the back end of the life cycle. And when it gets to the chemistry side, again, looking at the intrinsic hazards of the chemicals, and sort of ascertaining, which are the greener options, and then making decisions along those lines. But again, the point being that it's really at that project level that you can start to get into some of those metrics, and those metrics, you can really use them to drive decisions.
As you're looking for different tools at each stage of the life cycle, like moving through it, oftentimes you can find resources, lists, and recommendations for almost a better way to do each stage. And I think that's the benefit of life cycle analysis, right? Is you're looking at every stage of the life cycle, from conception to infancy to maturity, and towards the end of life. And so if you take each moment in time, and try to think about what are some strategies, resources, and better ways of doing this now, then you can start to pinpoint specific tools. So even looking at ways and where materials are extracted, right? There's so much data now on the effects of material harvesting on the communities at which they're pulled from, whether or not we're talking about endangered species of like trees, or we're talking about habitat or ecosystem loss. So, where's a better place to pull from if we're going to be pulling at all, right? Do you even need to have, virgin materials to create this, right? So now you can start to imagine, there are systems in place now for material reuse, or for looking at commercial recycling, which is larger scale than what we imagine here, which is looking at, huge runoffs of like everything from fabrics to metals and things like that. So, and then also thinking about like localized ways of transporting things. So how much energy goes into getting things around? And then looking at measuring carbon footprint as we think about getting something from one place to another, or even thinking about how we take that material to form it into a hard good, right? So what goes into transforming these constituent materials into usable components, and thinking about ways to create a system to do that that's more efficient, less costly, and less intensive in terms of non-renewable energies, and also less polluting, and also safer, right? And also beneficial in some ways to other ways. So and even in that, looking at zero waste strategies to approach it. And then from transporting and assembly all along the sphere, you're looking at how does this impact the place that this is happening? How does this impact the people who are working on it? How does producing this impact the planet in some way? And how are we creating an efficient system? And when we have to move things around, are we doing that in an efficient way, from a standpoint of packaging to, the weight of things, to the method in which it's getting around to different places. And then getting all the way into the consumer's hands, like how do the consumers even understand the impact of this product? And I think that's something to also consider as we are designing, is eco-design strategies can be in the voice and come from designers and engineers and scientists and chemists who are developing materials and goods. But at the end of the day, without the will to purchase it, none of these goods would really exist. With the same, maybe with the exception of like building materials, right? So if consumers are going to buy it, if we can inform the consumer about the impact of this, we can essentially produce more educated folks who are making better decisions. And so they could decide not to buy things that are going to be more harmful, or buy things that are going to be better or more sustainable, or have sort of like that believability and just trust. And so there's corporations now that are even allowing, or not corporations, there's corporate designations. So like B Corps, for instance, which are benefit corporations, has its own assessment that which looks at, how companies treat people, how their goods impact people, how it impacts the planet, how it treats, how, all those impacts on the planet, et cetera, that are, and looking at profit as well. And so there are these measures in which companies can go through in terms of assessing themselves and then actually having an index. So you can choose to buy goods from companies that seem to be more beneficial. And those are informed by the UN sustainability goals, but it also is sort of like this publicly disclosed measure of how sustainable a company may or may not be. And then looking also at strategies for making the use of that product more efficient. Everything from the energy that goes into keep making it run, to thinking about, are there systems of ways of reclaiming it or repairing it or upkeeping it? And once someone is done with it, is there a system in place in which to collect it responsibly? And I remember like when the fluorescent bulbs came in, the compact fluorescents, there wasn't much education about the ways in which mercury can pollute our soil. But, but there was instructions on like, make sure you take it to the hardware store to get recycled. No one's doing that. So we just threw it away, not knowing that, we were really polluting not just the landfill, but the soil everywhere, and how harmful that would be to our lungs. So if we don't have those kinds of systems in place to make sure that people can do the right thing, then we lose control of it. And we're not really thinking about sustainability at all parts of the life cycle. We're just thinking about one part at a time. But I think we always have to be thinking about the whole entirety, kind of in our periphery, even if we are just concentrating on one aspect of it in our venture and in our innovation work.
And so I like that idea of looking deep in the value chain and really asking the questions around, what is this impact going to be on energy or climate or carbon or something like that. It brings sort of a recent example that we have right now, where we have a product, it's sort of a finished good that's going into a system, and we're evaluating that finished good. Like currently it's sourced from China, let's say, and there might be an opportunity to produce that same finished good domestically. So, in the past, a prime driver of that decision, of course, would be the financial metrics, of course. And, as a business, that's still important, but you see more and more project teams, right, who don't have formal sustainability responsibilities asking about sustainability, asking about the carbon footprint. And so in sort of enabling this choice, somebody's actually thinking, well, hey, rather than sort of ship this thing, thousands of miles across the world, if it's closer to home, is that actually going to give us a lower carbon footprint in the supply chain? And so, we're seeing these questions come about, and actually the answer to that one, like any good LCA person would say, is it depends on the mode of transportation, because, transporting something by truck is far more carbon intensive than shipping something via ocean. So it might not be as intuitive as some folks would think, but at least we're seeing more folks asking those questions, and we have the tools that can help to answer them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Can I just would love to comment on something that Sean had said earlier, in which, Sean, you said you referred to the circular economy. And that is certainly one of the kind of metaphors that has become very powerful. Ever since the Ellen MacArthur Foundation released all those fantastic graphics everyone wants to have their bio cycles and their technical cycles, and the students do very skillful diagrams representing these kind of circular systems that their products exist within. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that this metaphor, this circular metaphor, it's a false metaphor. Nothing is that simple. And it's almost impossible to be circular in the way that that diagram represents the system. It's so much messier. Instead of drawing a circle like this, you're really drawing some crazy line that, because it may not go back here, but it may split and go over there. And I'm wondering how you speak to design teams or about the fact that the life cycle and the ongoingness, right, is a very, very messy thing. And nevertheless, we still have to plan for all of that. It's not as neat and tidy as the circle that we're kind of teaching. So I'm just curious to know how you would respond to that, and you too, Raja, because it's something I'm grappling with right now.
No, it's a great point, and certainly, the reality of today's economy and tomorrow's economy is extremely messy. I almost look at the butterfly diagram that you're sort of referring to, and just the circular economy mindset as a design philosophy, as opposed to like a blueprint for where we need to get to right now. I think it also depends on the type of materials that you're working with, right? So if you're looking at more of a commodity material like a polyethylene, polypropylene, whatever it is, that goes into just myriad applications. The reality of what happens at the end of life of all those things and how they come back to some useful second life, third life, fourth life, that may be a different answer than like a highly engineered material. If you think about something like a solid surface countertop, I'll use the Korean design example. That material has its own sort of value chain, and it's conceivable that you could actually bring that back in some way at the end of life. And so you could, there are some highly engineered places where you might have sort of loops that approach the perfection idea of circularity. But if you take a step back and elevate at the overall economy level, yes, extremely complex. I think what's important is that we have that mentality that waste is a human concept. And in nature, there's nothing wasted. So how do we incorporate that in this material economy that ultimately allows us to thrive at the same time?
I always think about the interface flooring as a case study. And I know that they've been around for a long time, but it was a concept that was sort of novel to me in that when I heard about it initially, it wasn't described as a circular system. It was just described as a system design that was beneficial, but me as a consumer immediately associated it with life cycle thinking. And this was like back in maybe like 2000 or 2001. I was volunteering at a museum as part of a service day as an undergraduate student. And as our thing, we were pulling up carpet tiles at a science center. And the person who was there just happened to talk about the company that made it. They're like, oh, this is a company that's from Georgia. They make these carpet tiles. They make them out of materials that are corn-based. But the way that the system goes is they come back and they pick up the tiles and they take them and they shred them up and they put them back in their new materials, right? And I was like, that's so smart, because I would have just thrown them in the dumpster, not knowing that a system like that came in place. Like, oh, you can't even get this carpet unless you buy their service. So they're not a carpet business, they are corporate service, right? And thinking about new models and ways of approaching it that from the outset are designed for circularity. I think it has to come with intention. It can't be about a product that is just out there and you're trying to figure out a way to like get some benefit from it. I think if you design with the end in mind, then you can design a product with the materials, with the support structure and everything that would go into it, that so it can be circular. So I think circularity is the intention, and then the products have to fit in on all the touch points in which consumers would act, or users would actually interface with those products, have to be considerate of that fact. I think it's really hard to take a product and then figure out how to do something with it once we're done with it that pulls it back into the system. That's not just, no, now it's materials for someone to have to come up with a way to use them. So I think if you are imagining circularity as the way that so it can work and doesn't seem like you're shoehorning it in or having to like come up with a million different ways to make parts of it circular, then you'll have to think of the whole entire service, the whole entire, like, I guess even the experience map, right? Or the life cycle of that product as being one of circular design. And I think that that's something that people aren't always thinking because they already have products that are out in the world or they've already come up with an idea. But if you're coming it up with it without thinking about circularity in mind, then you're kind of stuck with sort of just coming up with a better strategy to deal with it at end of life, right? So that becomes harder to do.
I think that's just such an important concept. I mean, it hits on these trends of design for disassembly, design for deconstruction that we're seeing in the building and construction area, and undoubtedly in other places as well. I'm sitting right here in a house that was built 118 years ago, and so you can bet that when they built this house, they weren't thinking about how do we take it apart and repurpose as many things as we can and make that disassembly easy and easy to separate the materials, so you don't have this crazy mixed component stream to deal with. And that's where we need to get to for sure, right? The idea that anything that goes into your house at some point can be repurposed in another way. And that is a design decision that you can make at the beginning. It's just, a matter of having that intention to begin with. And that itself does represent a pivot from, where we've been in the past to where we need to go.
Yeah. And I would only add to that, we have this special category of product that's called packaging that seems to defy, all of those best laid plans. And that is definitely an area where makers, where designers need to step up and apply the same principles to packaging that they do to kind of the higher price goods.
And I don't want to derail the conversation, but it's interesting you bring that up. One of the projects for the Cleantech Challenge this year, I'm going to give a bit of a preview on it, is actually focused on creating renewable packaging materials. And it was inspired by the founder being themselves a business owner and saying, I just can't stand that I'm constantly having to use these kind of materials. And what can I do? And that really inspired the project, then pursued it through their team. So tomorrow we're going to be seeing what they've brought to the table, and I'm pretty excited that this is so important. We never know where our projects are going to come from, and that's really inspiring. And I know the story behind that project. I know that was something they pursued outside of the classroom because they were a business owner. That's how they became inspired for that. But what are some advice or things that you would suggest to students as they are looking at ideas and looking at things outside the classroom in order to kind of break away from these traditional models of, well, at the end of it, not only it's not just a good, it's a service, or that, looking at where the next step is with, and I certainly think, thinking in the circular is really beneficial, but it has to go deeper as well. What are things that they can pursue outside of the classroom to find these avenues for innovation?
I think we have to talk to people about what they actually do. I think we design with so many assumptions about, because no, I don't think, maybe there are supervillains out in the world, but I think most students are designing products trying to solve a need or have some benefit to society. No one is seeking to melt the ice caps or pollute. No one's doing that. But when you design a package and if it doesn't get disposed of properly, it's going to pollute, right? So the assumption is that people will do things that you don't intend for them to do, that are not in the instructions. So you might design a package to be reusable or compostable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if people's habits or their it's looking at their community structure to support them doing that means it may not happen. So something that is compostable usually means that it's industrial compostable. So unless someone has like a service that's coming to their house to pick it up for industrial compost, or it's part of their waste management system, or they're going to drive it to a composter, then it doesn't really matter that the material is greener. It's still going to go in a landfill because people's actual habits don't reflect what your intent is. So you can have the best laid plans, but if you don't understand what people's experiences are really like, or what their habits are, or what their wants or needs or pitfalls or hurdles might be in enacting that vision, or even their appetite to do it, maybe they just don't really care, then it's important for you to understand that that's going to be the thing. People are in the equation. So you really have to study and talk to them and understand what things might take place that are actually going to be in line with your system design or your product design. Knowing everything from, like, there are all the warning and safety labels on every product, because we are assuming that products are going to be misused. We must also assume that even if the people have to be in charge of something happening in order for a product to truly be sustainable, then we have to either future proof or have a foolproof way for that to happen, or seize control over it in some way. So for instance, like the interface example, you can't buy their carpet unless you buy their service, right? One doesn't come with the other. So it wasn't a buy the carpet, oh, and then here's an add-on. It becomes part of the entire product system. So I do think that it's important for all users, or all designers, excuse me, to talk to the end users, and really study and understand their contextual constraints. What are their habits? What are their lifestyles like? If you're designing something that's going to sprout seeds, is that going to be an invasive species in their neighborhood? Do they even have like green space to plant anything, or they live in a hardscape, right? Packaging was a great thing to bring up, because I do think that I've been getting a lot of really cool packaging that's made to be repurposed. But what if I didn't want it? So you put all of this energy into these extra durable materials with extra coatings on things that now are non-recyclable because they're, composite materials, hoping that I would reuse it for indefinitely. But I don't like it because the color is blue, and I don't use blue in my house. Just kidding. I love my box. I just got a really cool underwear box that I like used as an underwear drawer. And every time you look at the reviews, people are like, this underwear box is amazing. But it was way over packaged. It could have come in something that was very tiny, that probably this big for the amount of stuff that I got. But I got this big, beautiful box instead. But once I start doing that and collecting those, now you're giving me more trash to have to dispose of eventually. So without having actually talked to users to understand how that would be used, that could have been a gamble that could have led to a point where we're just increasing the amount of the carbon footprint for a product that really could have been very, very simple, lightweight, and efficient to transport.
I think that idea of getting out there and understanding, why are things done the way they are today is a baseline start for, kind of bringing those innovative ideas to life. Maybe there's a good reason why something is done in some way. Maybe nobody's just thought of what you're thinking of. But until you really understand why a user of a product is doing something right, there are ethnography type studies where you can actually study, learn from a group of folks who are, they need to bend something up at this angle, and they're shooting some kind of spray up that way versus other things. But you learn just from that actual in the field sort of understanding versus the designing many wonderful things in the lab. And so that's just a concept, but I think there are those opportunities where you can even volunteer and get some of that experience depending on what it is. The building a construction space, we do a lot of work with Habitat for Humanity. Our innovation teams get out there, they're building on job sites, they're learning, they're coming up with ideas. And again, to kind of see, oh, well, if I want to put this insulation board up and then put this wrap around it, actually, my new idea over here will work because I understand why in the job site they need to do A before B.
I agree with what both of you have been saying, and I would also add that not only do designers have to include deep research into their user and into the context, in which the product or the system will be used, but oftentimes designers are designing things for places, on the other side of the world. And at best, they'll go there for a week and maybe not even speak the language. And then they'll come back and design something and presume that this can just be taken and will be, that people will be overjoyed to have this latest kind of design. And that is what I would caution designers, I would caution makers, that if you're proposing to design solutions for a community that you're not a part of, you better be prepared to become part of that community, because I'm sorry to say this, but as designers, we can be very arrogant. We fall in love with our designs. We think everybody else should love them as well, and then we're really surprised when nobody wants it or it's not being used as intended. So again, sustainability gives you a purpose in life. If you're a maker and you want to make something for some other place in the world, then there's your passion. Go there, live there, and design with a real understanding of what is needed and desired.
Yeah, I do think that culturally informed, but as well as like participatory and community-based like design is a more sustainable approach to, instead of just going into a lab or going to a studio and coming up with some novel idea and seeing how it lands. It really is important to design with and not just for.
I think that is such a lovely note for us to wrap up on. Through our programming and preparing teams for the Cleantech Challenge, we talk so much about not only getting to know your customers, getting to know who your consumer is. Sometimes your consumer sometimes a consumer for your consumer product is actually another business, and that you need to get to know not only who the end user is, but who those businesses are, how they buy, how they purchase, how all of that affects the total ecosystem. We also reinforce that you often need to look outside of your own neighborhood for where your innovation might have the biggest impact. And all of these notes are exactly what creates such a huge impact, what creates this wonderful environment for makers to look and to learn. But they need to learn themselves about who they're speaking with, who they're speaking to, and really what they need to pursue. And we love that. We are always saying, get outside the classroom, talk to people, get to know not who you think is going to be buying this, but actually find out who they are. What problems do they have in their lives? What problems do they need solved that may not have anything to do with your product, but it really goes to the core of who they are when you're looking at what they're dealing with, what situations they're in, and what their investments are, what they value. I think that's just such a lovely note to reinforce that it is so important that you're not just designing for a person on paper, but you're designing for an actual person. So I can't thank you guys enough for being with us today. And I hope in the future you hear from one of our students who are trying to get more information and learn more and reaching out. It's so important for everyone to do those interviews, to reach out, to say, I've seen this, I've read this, can you just tell me more? Tell me what you were feeling when you wrote this. Tell me what you were learning whenever you put this out there. What were you thinking when you said this? And I love that. So thank you guys all so much for being with us. And I hope you're able to tune in tomorrow and see some of the very best that Portland State has to offer.